Thank you for bringing Seattle weather a day early. Gets me adjusted to it. In his book, The Worst Financial Mistakes in the Bible, the author Chuck Bentley tells the story of the widow who came to Elisha and said, "My husband died, and now his creditors are coming and taking away my children." Chuck Bentley mentions this as one of the top mistakes in the Bible, not because of what the widow did, but because of the lack of planning of her husband. And today we're going to talk about the importance of planning, and we don't want anyone within your sphere or this sphere to be the widow or widower who didn't plan properly. That emulates the widow that spoke to Elisha. So I told you yesterday that this presentation was originally done primarily for women, and the reason is because at least in our community, we saw a lot of households where the husband handled the finances and just said, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it. I'll take care of things. And we've seen a real groundswell from women saying, "We need to know more about this, and we need to know how to plan, and we need to know how to move forward in our senior years," and for good reason. These are some statistics that we found that relate to women. Right now, women control 51% of the wealth in the U.S., and by 2030, the women are projected to control 66% of the wealth in the U.S., which would be about $30 trillion. The average age of widowhood, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, is 59 years old. And the average woman will spend 12.48 years in widowhood. Then when the financial advisors started looking at this shift as couples age, 70 to 80% of widows changed their financial advisor within 1 year of their spouse's death. And so financial advisors started saying, "Hey, hello, if you want to keep your clients, you better recognize that you and your conversation with your buddy on the golf course probably needs to change to a few conversations with both husband and wife." Now, I want to say that while this is an issue for a lot of women, it's also the opposite, because there are a number of households where the women handle the finances and the men do the work and the labor, and the women handle all the finances. So whether you find yourself in a male-dominated household as far as finances, or a female-dominated household as far as the finances, it's really important that both of you plan if you're in a married relationship. What we do know for certain about the future, absolutely know for certain, is that change will happen in an uncertain way. No question, change is happening in an uncertain way, and so we need to be prepared for it. So let me start with words of Jesus, and let's talk about why I titled this Planning for Peace of Mind. My first thing I'd like to tell you is don't act like a pagan. Do not act like a pagan. Let me explain why I said that. Matthew 6:25 through 34, here's what Jesus had to say to us. And I'm going to try to read this in the tone that I think Jesus said it, but I don't know. But I'm going to try not to be, again, in a directive, commanding way, but more in a friend giving you some good advice way. So Jesus in chapter 6 says, "Therefore I say to you, don't worry about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, nor about your body, what you'll put on. Isn't life more than food, and the body more than clothing? Look at the birds of the air. Look at them. For they neither sow nor reap, nor gather into barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not more valuable than they? And which of you, by worrying, can add even 1 cubit to your stature? So why do you worry about clothing? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet I say to you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed as one of those, or as one of them. Parenthetical. I'm going to get back to that passage, but I just have to tell you this, because I think I may have gone crazy, but I have fallen in love with the flower, the dahlia. I don't think there is a flower growing anywhere that better represents the glory of God than the dahlia. Now, if you are a dahlia grower, you know that there are over 60,000 varieties of dahlias in every color and shape, and they are amazing. And they come up from the ground, they get this little bud, and all of a sudden they just explode with color. And so I've started raising dahlias, and I cut them and I bring them to the office, and my staff, oh, not another dahlia. But the reason I do is just to demonstrate the glory of God in his creation and to remind us if he can produce that. Now, so let me get back to, now if God so clothes the grass of the field, which is today is here and tomorrow is thrown in the oven, will he not much more clothe you? You little faith. And then he gets to the pagan side. Therefore, don't worry, saying, what will we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? For after all these things, now I put it in New King James here, which is the Gentiles, but I like the New International Version better, where it says, for after these things, the pagans seek. For your heavenly Father knows that you have need of all these things. And then he gives us the formula. But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and then all these things will be added to you. Therefore, don't worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about its own things. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. Can we just live in that peace? Can we live in that peace? Now, why in the world am I going to talk about planning if we can just, well, I'll tell you about that in a moment, but what do we take from this passage? First, everything belongs to God. We started this whole conference, or this whole session out with, everything belongs to God. And he knows what we need. And if we'll just seek his kingdom first, he'll provide for our needs. Now, this problem of us worrying and God providing and worrying about God providing, this isn't new. This isn't to our generation. This has been for generation after generation. Jesus wrote about this in 38, or spoke about this in 30 A.D., and we're still having to deal with how do we keep from worrying. But I remember a little poem my mother used to always share, and I'm going to see if there are any poets here. I'll say the poem. I'll say the poem and the author, and then you see if you can tell me the poem. Written in 1859. The poem is Overheard in the Orchard by Elizabeth Cheney. Can anybody tell me what that poem is?
Yes. Let me think.
Should I give you the first line? Oh, go. You got it.
Said the robin to the sparrow, friend, I think that,
I should...
I gotta sing it. Said the robin to the sparrow, I should really like to know why these anxious human beings rush about and worry so. Said the sparrow to the robin, friend, I think that it must be that they have no heavenly Father, such as cares for you and me.
I had no idea that was set to music, but it's awesome. That's awesome. I think my mom said that often because she had the gift of worrying and she was reminding herself. But just a great reminder. So why do we need to be planning then if we don't have to worry? Well, don't worry doesn't mean don't plan. It doesn't mean just bury your head in the sand and say, everything will be fine. That's not what a faithful steward does. But in our planning, we don't fret and wring our hands. We just plan. In fact, Scripture is full of cautions about being wise and planning for the future. I think I've got Scripture on the board. There we go. Proverbs 27:12 says, "The prudent sees danger and take refuge, but the simple keep on going and pay the penalty." And in Luke, Jesus said, I shared this with you yesterday, if you've not been trustworthy with worldly wealth, who will entrust you the true riches? So it is important that we plan for our future, seeking God first in His kingdom, but then trusting that as we plan, God will provide for our needs. So, why should we plan? Well, first of all, planning expresses love for our spouse and our family and our loved ones. I hate it when I hear people say, "Doesn't matter, I'll be dead. I don't have to worry about it. We'll let them mess with it." What are you saying? I don't care about anybody else. I just care about myself. You want the chaos that will come with no planning? You say, "I'll let my kids deal with that." What you mean is, I'll let my kids or somebody else fight. Proverbs 21:5 says, "The plans of the diligent lead surely to plenty, but those of everyone who is hasty surely lead to poverty." One of the saddest things that I hear regularly as I meet with people to do planning is the story of the chaos of their families or their friends or their neighbors. And if we had time today, I'm quite confident that I would hear some of those stories from your experiences. I remember one of our clients who gave me some excellent advice on how to handle estates, and it happened to be, I got that advice 1 week before my parents passed away. Both parents passed away within 48 hours of each other. I'm just going to tell you, if I can go that way, that's the way I want to go. Is a massive blessing. They were 88 and 89, and the Lord blessed them by neither one of them having to mourn for each other. But 1 week before, this friend of mine told me how some experience he had and then how he handled his parents' estate, and it was a gift to me because we were able to take the plans my parents had put in place and implement them with a minimum of stress. But even best families have a lot of stress during this time of transition, intergenerational transfers. I heard one family within like an hour of the parents' death, the kids were at each other. Another one I actually had to supervise as siblings fought over their parents' belongings. One sister said, "Oh, I just want to go in and have one of Mom's pillows because I just really want to remember her with the pillow." And she went in and got the pillow, and with the pillow went about $50,000 of jewelry, and then she carried it out in the pillow. You know, I mean, this is the chaos that can happen. But when you plan well, you can provide for the orderly transfer of your assets entrusted to you. And you can leave the right kind of inheritance to your children. Proverbs 13:22 said, "A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children." Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to give money to not only your kids but your grandkids, but you leave an inheritance, a legacy of something good, not chaos. So, if we're going to finish well, if we're going to be a good steward of God's resources, and if we're going to plan well, there's some essentials that we need to know. And I'm going to talk to all of you, but I'm going to talk especially to you couples where one of you handles most of the business and financial affairs. Because the other person, it's really important that you know some things. And so the first thing is you need to know what you have and where it's located. Now, I'm going to just tell you that you're going to have, in the next few days, you're going to have conversations about this, I know, because there's people in here that need to do this. And the immediate reaction of the person that handles the finances is going to be avoidance. It's a human reaction. And we just kind of avoid this conversation. And we're going to say something like this. Listen, I've got it handled. I'll take care of it. I'll make sure this is all handled. Okay? If that's your natural reaction, that's the wrong answer. You got to step back from that desire to just be the protector and the caretaker and say, yes, we need to talk about this. I got to make sure you know. So, talk through what you have. Where are your accounts? Where are your assets located? You don't have to have all the details, but you need to have the high points, and you need to know, where do I go to find what I need? Where do I go? Who do I talk to? Example, one couple, not one, many couples we've talked with that have kept their assets separate. We find out that in the middle of our planning, one of the spouses finds out what their net worth is in the middle of our conversation. Because one of the things we talk about is what's the property that we need to plan around. And we're sitting there, and one of the spouses kind of looks strange, and I realize this is the first time they've ever come to terms with what their net worth is. Not best practice. Second, you need to know what your expenses are. So you need to know what you have and where it is. Second, you need to know what your expenses are. Now, this doesn't mean that both parties in a couple have to do all the bills, but you at least need to know where they are. What is your discretionary income, and how much are you spending, and how much is your fixed or your discretionary expenses? What are your fixed costs that have to be handled? For example, we had one of our clients, husband passed away, and this was Lois's statement. In fact, she actually spoke about this in one of these sessions. She said, I really didn't know if I had enough money to buy a new blouse or to buy a new car. Because if you don't know what you have and what your expenses are, okay, on the cash flow, what's okay, what's not okay. Also, find out what are you giving and why, and where are you making these gifts to. Why? How much can you afford to give if one of the spouses is handling all the giving and all of a sudden they're gone or unable to handle their affairs? How much can you afford to give? All right, so you need to know what you have, you need to know what your expenses are, and then you need to think about who you need to plan for. First of all, you need to plan for yourself. How will you manage as you age and you need assistance? I love this statement that a friend of mine said. I want to make sure that I make a decision before I have to. Now, this is a really hard deal because all of us want to stay as independent as possible, and we have this fight to I'm not going into an assisted living center, or I'm not doing this, or I'm not doing that. I'm going to drive till I'm 100, And we want to hold on. I mean, it's a natural tendency for all of us. We want to hold on. And what happens is we hold on tight, and then all of a sudden we find ourselves past the ability to make the right decision. And so it's really important that we just relax on this, let go of our demands that we're going to hold on to this decision. I know when you're dealing with your parents, you can look at them and say, oh, they should have done that differently. When we're looking down and our kids are talking to us, a little different. But if you can, keep your, again, hands open, relax, saying, okay, God, what decisions do I need to make now in anticipation of what's going to happen in the next 2 to 3, 5 years? There's a gal lived in Newport Beach who she just had the uncanny ability to make a decision before she needed to. She moved out of a big house into a condo, lived in that condo, did all of her own investments. Astounding how well she did. She just invested and day traded and was making money hand and over fist. And she really was doing well. And then I called her one day and she said, I'm going to move out of my condo and I'm selling my car. Would you like to buy my car? Because I told her what a nice car it was. Anytime you can get a 20-year-old car with 20,000 miles on it, if you ever want to sell that car, I got kids. I would joke with her, and she said, would you like to buy my car? I said, no, sell it to your son. And she did. But she said, I'm going to sell my car. I said, really? Really? She said, I think it's just time. I think I'm going to move. I love my place. I swim every day, but I think I'm going to move to a retirement center. I've been looking at one, and it looks like it's going to be a good place. I think it'd be good for my future. And she made the decision before she had to, but when she moved in, I think she saw that her brain was starting to give her trouble, and so she decided, I think I'm going to get past this before I have to and before I start making big mistakes. And then she'd call me from the retirement center. Oh, yeah, I made some great friends, and she's having a great time. She just lived kind of arms wide open and decided she's going to enjoy wherever she was. And I want to encourage you to try to think that way if you can. Then you need to be planning so you need to plan for yourself. And if you're married, you need to be planning for your surviving spouse. And, none of us want to be the person that's mentioned in this book that didn't provide for the surviving spouse. So what do we need to do? Now, I was sensitized today to the fact that many of you are blended families, second marriages, or kids on both sides from different marriages. And this, of course, puts a complicator in your planning, because are you going to allow all of your assets from your first marriage and maybe your kids, are you going to allow those to be used for the support of your spouse? Or are those assets going to go to your kids? Or are they used for your spouse until your spouse passes and then it goes to the kids? Or do you just mix everything together and it's going to all the kids multiple ways? I don't think there's any one right answer to this. It's all dependent on your family dynamics. But it's important to plan for this because, again, we don't want the kind of chaos that we hear about all too often when we don't plan properly. So planning for provision, living arrangements, planning for protection of assets, assistance, direction. Now, unlike the story of the widow with Elisha, Joseph was tasked for 7 years to plan for a future that only he knew about. God had revealed to him. And so he spent 7 years planning. It is not wrong to plan 7 to 10 years out. I want to encourage you to do so. Then we need to think about children and other loved ones. How will they use what we entrust to them? remember, if we are stewards of God's resources, He's blessed us with this, a lot of things, but let's just say blessed with these financial resources. Our society has given us the privilege of being able to tell where these assets that we're holding now go next. And so we have the legal right to say what is in my name, I can give wherever I want. So, in the legal terms, I'm transferring my assets. In spiritual terms, I'm entrusting someone else with God's resources that He's entrusted to me. So who are you going to entrust those to? Almost all parents say, I want it to go to my kids. People without kids want it to go to some loved one. Nieces, nephews, friends, whoever. But when you think about it from a stewardship perspective, how much is appropriate to put in the hands of this next steward? How much is enough? How much is maybe too much? Will it be helpful or will it be harmful? So you got to think about children. I think about a client that I had in one of the central states, professional, very sizable net worth, and his wife had passed, and we were talking, and he said, I really got to get my affairs in order, and so we were talking and looked at his net worth, and then I said, okay, so what's your current plan? Well, right now it all goes to my daughter, and I said, okay, so your daughter will receive X million dollars. And I mean, the color just drained out of his face, and I said, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Oh, he said, oh, that's terrible. I mean, it will destroy her marriage. I know, it'll destroy her marriage. And I said, okay, well, what are you going to do? He said, there's no way I can give her more than X dollars, or it would be very destructive. So then we started talking about what he's going to do with the rest of his estate. Another client just down the road here, we spent probably a year and a half working on what to do with the spendthrift daughter. A lovely young lady that never met somebody who wasn't a friend and would give the shirt off her back and the last dollar in her pocket to whoever asked with no regard for her future. And so she spent everything she had plus whatever the credit card companies would allow. And mom bailed her out once, mom bailed her out twice, and now she realized, I can't put money in her hands. So then how do we plan for that person? And there are ways that you can help them. We do that we help a lot of people like that. So those are the people you need to plan for. So we've talked about what you have, what your expenses are, who you need to plan for. And then you need to make sure you have good counsel. Who is going to help with this, structuring this plan, but also implementing the plan? I encourage everyone to think about, when they're alone, who will your board of advisors be? Build your board of advisors. And if you're a couple, help your surviving spouse develop who their board of advisors will be. Proverbs 15:22 said, without counsel, plans go awry, but in the multitude of counselors, they are established. Isaiah said, okay, so it's important to have counselors, but it's also important to have the right kind of counselors, because you're going to find some counselors that are all about just the American dream agenda and will not ask any questions like, will your children be able to handle these resources? Will they be a good steward? How much should you give to your children? How much should you give elsewhere? Oftentimes those questions don't get asked because the value of the counselor may not be having the same values as you. In fact, in Isaiah 30, Isaiah warns, he says, woe to the rebellious children, says the Lord, who take counsel, but not of me, and who devise plans, but not of my spirit, that they may add sin upon sin. Here's a great example. Big downtown law firm in Chicago, working with a client, set up some very sophisticated trust to pump money down to the children. They were pumping money to the children as fast as they could. And the client went to his lawyer and said, hey, I'm really concerned. I'm watching my kid in his 20s burn through money like crazy, and I think I made a mistake here. The lawyer said to him, oh, don't worry. There's so much more money where that came from. It doesn't matter how much he burns through. And that client said to me, at that moment, I realized I had the wrong lawyer. We know the damaging power of too much wealth in the hands of somebody who doesn't know how to handle it. And so we don't want to do that. And so you need to make sure you have good counsel. Who's your lawyer? Who's your accountant? Who's your financial advisor? Who handles your insurance? Who handles your tax returns? If you handle this all and your spouse is not handling this, please give a gift to your spouse by at least introducing them and by at least bringing them in. They don't need to make all the decisions. They don't need to get involved in all the nitty-gritty details, but you got to make sure that they have a relationship. So if you're out of the picture, they can carry on. And if they need that advice, if you keep your finances separate, you're in a blended family and you keep your finances separate, at least make sure that both of you have good counsel and you know who your board of advisors are. All right, now let's talk about the elements of your plan. Obviously, the very first thing we need to do is just work on what are our expectations and goals for the next 3 to 5 years? And what are the decisions we need to make so that we don't have to make them in a crisis? You may be able to make a decision that doesn't actually force you to act today, but you just have a plan in place so that when event A happens, it triggers that decision. And I want to encourage you to start working on that for your goals for the next 3 to 5 years. And I realize my invitation for you to work on this is the invitation for difficult conversations. And as you step into these difficult conversations, I really want you to pray at first. And when you get into some heat, step away and ask God for wisdom, because the conversations need to be had, but they're hard. And if they're hard for you and your spouse, yeah, they're hard. Don't, you're in good company. These are hard for the couples that have the best communication skills. They're difficult. The second element of your plan is to make provisions for help with health and financial decisions while you're alive, but you can't make them. We call this power of attorney. You're giving someone else the power to act as your agent, your decision maker. So that's what that word power of attorney is. And the person you name under that power of attorney document is your agent. You can name your spouse, you can name your kids, you can name some other third party, but that power of attorney document gives somebody else the ability to act for you. Each state, and I'm sure in Canada, each province has different names for these parties. Almost all in the United States is called a durable power of attorney for property, and then a power of attorney for health care. In some states, we call it a health care advocate. In others, we call it a power of medical directive. But it's important that you have this document put in place for both your financial affairs and also your medical, your health decisions. And then you need to make sure, so you get those documents in place, and then you need to be planning for around after your lifetime. Almost everybody thinks in terms of you need to have a will. Now, the reality is You might have a will, and you might have a revocable living trust, and you might have an irrevocable living trust, and you might have an intentionally defective grant or retained annuity trust. Okay, I'm not going to get into that today. This is the big problem with us lawyers. We have a vocabulary that that we can tell you all about these words, and it really doesn't matter to you. But what you need to have is directions for after your lifetime, for the handling of your affairs, for your surviving spouse, and for your loved ones, so that the assets you own now can be transferred without a hassle. Now, if I'd been asked to do an estate planning seminar, I would have walked through all these documents, and I'm not going to do that today. And I'm sure you guys have these, and I'd be very, very surprised if you all don't have those documents in place. But if you haven't updated them in the last 3 to 5 years, maybe 2 years, it's probably worth taking a look at it. Who have you named as your representative or executor? Who are the beneficiaries? If things happen in your children or your other loved ones' lives that have changed and you need to adjust it. Divorce, marriage, more children. If there's something that's changed, get it cleaned up. Get it amended. Let me spend a little bit more time on caring for your kids. There's two things. There are two things that I see people doing that are really, really sad mistakes. And the one is giving people too much money at one time that is not helpful. It actually harms them. Or giving too much money to people in a way that harms them. Any transfer that steals people's initiative and in their integrity becomes harmful. And so I know none of us, when we're making these gifts, we want to help and not harm. And so I just want to encourage you, as you're looking at your plan, say, is this actually going to be helpful for our kids? Is it going to enable them to do anything but keep them from being able to do nothing? Or is it actually going to rob their initiative? And I'm going to say this for kids, grandkids, great-grandkids, on and on. The other thing that I see happening is the wayward child, the family that has left, and we decide that we're going to make them pay. We're going to make them pay. And so I've met with several people where they said, we're cutting our son out. We're cutting him out. Now, I don't want to make a decision for you, but I just want to make sure that if you have made that decision to cut your kids out of your estate plan, I just want you to make sure you know that that's the last statement you want to say to them. Do you really want the last thing you say to your kids to be, you're out of the family? Because that stings. I'll tell you, that stings really hard. And even if somebody is completely away from the Lord and away from your values and everything, do you really want to say that? Or do you want to leave some space for God's mercy and some space for God's grace to reach them? So I remember talking with a fellow who was really rigid on this. My son did X, Y, Z, and he's gone. He's not getting $1. And I shared this. Do you really want that to be your last statement, or do you want to leave some room for God's mercy in his life? Because we all hope that they will turn to the Lord at some point in their life. And he paused and he said, yeah, I want to leave room for God's mercy. And I don't know what they decided to do because they were still trying to figure it out. But I walked to the car, and the wife followed me out to the car, and she said, thank you for saying this. I know we need to do something different for our son because he's a good young man, and he's just lost right now, and I don't want us to disown him. So if that's where your heart wants to go, please reconsider. I had another one where the father had done this. His wife passed. Kids were at the funeral, and they read the will the night before the funeral, and he was actually giving almost everything to charity. And I showed up at the funeral, and the kids decided that that plan must have been because it came from me. Do you know how to spell difficult conversation? It was one of the toughest conversations I've ever had in my life because, they came with, both barrels blazing straight at me. And fortunately, he had done this plan completely independent. I didn't even know his lawyer. And I was actually encouraging him to consider putting his kids back in. And so we had a pretty rigorous conversation. And then about 3 weeks later, had a conversation with the dad, and he said, I think I'm going to give him more. Yeah, I think I'm going to give him more. And the beautiful thing is over the next 18 months, they had substantial reconciliation in the family. And the kids still got a small share of the overall estate, but they were happy, and he provided a path for them back to the Lord. And of course, he had cut them out because of their spiritual decisions. So, think about that. Now, I see that we have a few minutes, and I'm going to wrap. I've got one more topic, and I'll wrap it up. But I want to just, because we've got a little bit smaller crowd today, I want to open it up in the last probably 5 or 10 minutes. If you have a question or a thought that you'd like to share, we're going to open it up for questions. So you can just be thinking about that. But before we do, I want to circle back on something I talked about yesterday, and that is supporting kingdom causes close to your heart. Many people that we work with say, we love our kids and we want most of what we have going to our kids. But we also want our children to hear from us that God's work is really important, and that we have supported these ministries or these causes during our lifetime, and we want it to be part of our estate, or our final statement. Because your will is your final statement about what matters to you, to your family, and your world. And so when you make that statement, where you distribute your assets tells them what was important to you. And so if you decide to include ministries in your estate plan, like I said yesterday, you might want to tithe your estate, or maybe add one child to your distribution plan and add a child named Charity, and that child's share goes to charity, or some other percentage of your estate, or some assets. Maybe this property or that property is going to ministries we support, and the rest of these assets go to our kids. Whatever you do, I want to talk to you about your charitable side too, because large gifts to charity can be as problematic as large gifts to children who don't know how to handle it. So, some of you, I'd be willing to bet, I haven't read your wills, but I would be willing to bet that some of you have left money to your local church. And when you did this, your estate was here, and today your estate is here. And you were thinking about that money, and maybe you even said, I'd like to fund, if they need an organ, I'd like to fund an organ at the church. And now your estate's here, or vice versa, whatever. But that amount now is completely inappropriate for what you designated, or maybe inappropriate for the size of the church. And just on the phone this week with a guy who said, I'm pulling my church out because we just got about a $1.2 million gift, and the way they handled it was terrible, and I don't want my money to be handled that way. So look at the charities you've named and then ask yourself, is this an appropriate amount for the size of the charity? Will this be helpful or will this be harmful to them? If you say this could be harmful, but I'd still like to really support them, you might consider putting your gift to that charity in a fund that pays them income for a period of years, or pays them, maybe 10% of that amount each year for 10 years. Or maybe you say, I want to set up an endowment. The church doesn't have one, so I'm going to set it up with an outside entity, and I'm going to pay them a set amount of 5% per year, so my giving to the church continues on forever until the Lord returns. But whatever you do, I want to make sure that you think about, am I going to really be supporting a ministry to help it, or am I going to fund something and keep it alive long beyond its effectiveness? We have one of our clients who sent money, directed money to go to a church, and that church has been, they have an endowment, and now they have another endowment, and these funds will pay about 85% of the church's operating funds, and the effectiveness is gone. Effectiveness is gone. It would be much better, in my estimation. This is just Jim's opinion now. This is not God's word, this is just Jim's word. But I think it would be much more effective to sell that church and redeploy those funds somewhere else than to keep that church operating at the level that it is. Now, we've had a number of churches that have decided to close, and we've actually been a part of it. They close, they give the assets to our foundation, and then we redeploy those assets to another ministry. But if we can, we find another church that will buy that property so we can keep the gospel witness in that location. But we've got to, oftentimes a church has to close so that a new branch can, or a new shoot can come out of that and use the church, rather than, because reviving older churches sometimes can be really hard. And we probably have all seen that. So, when you're looking at your charitable gifts, make sure it's helpful to the church, to the ministry. It's appropriate for the size of the ministry, and if it's more than the ministry should handle in 1 year, give it to them over time. Okay, with that, let me just give you a little bumper on the next session, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. In the next session, this is all going to be about how we communicate to our kids that creates a lasting love letter to our loved ones. I heard a story this morning that was so precious, and if we have time to talk about it, I will. If not, you'll want to ask Addie what she's doing for her grandkids. It's pretty cool. Okay, let me just open it up for questions or comments. Yes. Okay, for those of you who didn't hear that, in Canada, if you have not specifically said that you don't want medical assistance in dying involved in your decisions, you have to exclude it. Did I say that correctly? Yeah.
Do you recommend, when you set up a will or a trust, that you let the beneficiaries know what's in there?
Next session. That's what we're going to be talking about. Yep. Oh, when you set up a will or a trust, do you let your beneficiaries know what's in there? And I'll just say this as a teaser for the next session. That the gap between what your beneficiaries expect and what they get, the larger that gap, the more chaos you're going to create. So the more they understand while you're alive, even if they don't like it, the better, because as that gap increases, the potential for explosions increases. Yes?
We're being advised by people to give a lot more to our kids
Yeah. This last statement was, we're being advised to give a lot more to our kids while we're alive than after. And this is so dependent on taxes, on your kids, on your goals, on your assets. One of the big challenges is if you have businesses, that the tax at death on businesses that need a lot of capital can really be crippling to the business after your passing. And so that's one of the reasons why they'll try to pump a lot of assets down. And there are a number of reasons why you may or may not want to do that. But I think that's one where you have to ask the question, is this wise, godly counsel, or is this simply counsel to avoid tax? So the man that I told about who was set up all these trusts, was pumping money to his kids. It was all wealth transfer, wealth preservation counsel. And in the flesh, it was a great idea. Avoided taxes, pumped money out of his estate. But from a kingdom perspective, he saw that it was not good. So you just need God's wisdom on that. And I would say, God's going to give you wisdom, but that is a strategy that a lot of people are using.
If you have an adult child who you don't feel like a lump sum would be a good idea at all, but, gradual monthly thing, what's that called? How do you set it up?
So different ways you can set it up, but most common, at least, if you have a child that you don't think would it would be helpful to give them a lump sum at death, your death, and you would just want to dribble out money to them over time, how would you set that up? So there are a number of different kind of trusts that you can set up. The one that is described a lot is a spendthrift trust, where you can send money, but they can't get the principal until you've released it, and even the income, they can't attach that income until they actually get it. So a spendthrift trust is one of them. I've got about 23 other options, but we won't get into that. Yes.
This is back to giving to charities.
Yes.
When you get requests from somebody you love that wants you to support their choice of charity or help them in ministry, do you have a right to question their ministry, or is it appropriate?
Wow. So I'm going to just tell you a little story. Oh, when you're doing planning, if somebody comes up and they have a charity that they want you to support, and they ask you to either support their charity or some charity that they're supporting, how should you handle that? Do you have a right to question that? And I would say absolutely, but I have to give you a little disclaimer. In our foundation, we train fundraisers on how to ask you all to include their charity in your will. In fact, I've trained Nick at Big Life to ask people, because I think this is an important question. Would you consider including Big Life in your will? And I'm happy to say to all of you, would you consider including Big Life in your will? I know that Big Life's a great ministry, and if you decided to include Big Life in your will, I think Nick would be happy, and so would I, because I think they're doing great work. Now, I'm not asking you today, but you are absolutely free to say, no, that's not where God's prompted us. And I appreciate your support of that ministry, but that's not where our heart is. Our heart is here. And if your heart is here and you want to support these ministries, then support them with everything you've got. And if somebody says, oh, I think you ought to support Wycliffe, or I think you ought to support Compassion International, yeah, good. Put your money where your mouth is. I think those are good ministries. But you should feel no obligation. But I'll also tell you that if I'm talking to fundraisers, I'll say, please, what's your first name? Mimi? I would say, please ask Mimi if she'd consider making a gift in her will, because she's a generous person. She'll probably want to. but then you don't have to say yes. I think I've kind of beat that horse to death, didn't I? One more question, and then we're going to turn it back to our music team. Yeah.
Are gifts given while you're living taxed on the person that you give them to? Do they have to pay taxes on that gift?
Are you a Canadian? I wish I had the answer for you. The answer in the U.S. is up to a certain level, no. Above that level, yes. I don't know the answer to that in Canada, I'm sorry to say. So sorry. The question is, if you give gifts to your children during lifetime, transferring part of your wealth to them, is that taxed during your lifetime? And you can do that in the U.S. Are you a Canadian? You were asking that very question. So is there anything you can give to your kids tax-free during a lifetime, or is that all taxed? Oh, okay. If it's after-tax money in Canada, there's no limit. That's different than the U.S. Yes, you can give money to your kids without them paying tax based on... Okay. All right. So at this point, we're going to break. We'll be back this afternoon for... the writing a lasting love letter to your children, and how to have family meetings, and how to communicate to your children. And I'm going to turn it over to Nick.